The rustle of paper echoed as my son's wife hissed, "You can't stay here without paying rent." Still, I didn't flinch, just folded the deed in half, slow enough for her to hear it crack. As she stood by my fireplace, her eyes darted, searching Nathan's face for answers he didn't have. While the room thickened with silence, I traced my name on the page, Eleanor Parker, sole owner. The same paper she thought didn't exist now weighed more than any words she could spit. That's when I handed it to my son and said, "Read it aloud. She'll want to hear it. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe." Eleanor stepped into the living room, the familiar scent of jasmine and old wood immediately wrapping around her like a blanket. The silence in the house felt thick, almost suffocating. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows through the large windows. She paused just inside the doorway, watching her son Nathan and his wife Lauren as they stood by the couch, their backs to her. Lauren was speaking, her voice sharp and calculating, but the words barely registered in Eleanor's mind. What she did catch, what made her blood briefly stir, was the arrogant tone with which Lauren spoke. "You can't stay here without paying rent." Eleanor's grip tightened around the leather purse she held. The calmness in her chest was a well-guarded fortress, but even the most seasoned stone could crack under pressure. And yet, she didn't let it show. Nathan, standing beside his wife, nodded with a half-hearted glance toward his mother. His eyes were glazed, distant, as if he couldn't quite place why the conversation felt uncomfortable. He had no idea that the woman he'd known as his mother for 42 years had legal control over more than just the house he grew up in. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a step further into the room, letting the sound of her shoes against the hardwood floor break the oppressive quiet. Her presence still, and as inevitable as the ticking of the clock on the wall, filled the space. She studied her son and daughter-in-law, two people who'd forgotten how to see her as anything but an elderly woman, someone they could push around with ease. But Eleanor Parker wasn't someone who could be pushed. Not anymore. Her eyes flicked to Lauren, whose hands rested on her hips with the kind of entitlement that came from thinking power was something one could demand. Eleanor could almost feel the weight of the younger woman's gaze, the expectation that she'd submit to the situation, to the words Lauren had just spoken. She didn't. Not even a little. Instead, Eleanor took a deep breath and turned her eyes toward her phone. She didn't need to speak yet. The calmness of the moment, the tension in the room, it was all part of the plan. She felt the vibration of the incoming text before she saw the name. It was Pat. "Call Victor immediately." Eleanor didn't hesitate. She tapped her phone, hands steady, as she dialed her attorney. She had been waiting for this moment, for the world to remind her that no one, not even family, was exempt from the law. Her gaze drifted across the room, to the mantel where family photographs rested in frames. Nathan's childhood smile, his awkward teenage years captured forever in those pictures. But what stood out most to Eleanor in that moment was the deed, the legal document that ensured her rights, the one that hung in her mind like a steady, unshakable anchor. She could almost see it, the weight of it, the quiet power it held. The house, the land, everything was hers. No one, certainly not Lauren, could tell her to pay rent here. Eleanor leaned back against the edge of the couch, gathering herself. Her heart remained steady, but her mind raced ahead, playing out the moves that would unfold over the next few moments. Pat was right. It was time to assert her authority. She didn't need to argue. She didn't need to plead her case. She only needed to present the truth. And the truth would silence them both. As she waited for Victor to pick up the phone, her thoughts ran ahead. She could almost hear the lawyer's voice in her ear, the quiet reassurance that everything was perfectly in her control. She'd never let it get this far, never allowed herself to be underestimated. But now that she had arrived at this moment, she knew. It was her turn. Lauren's voice broke through her thoughts again, louder now, demanding answers she wasn't going to give. Well? Lauren's eyes narrowed as she looked at Eleanor, sensing the shift in the air. Are you going to say something? Or just... The phone clicked, and Victor's voice filled Eleanor's ear, low and steady. Eleanor? What's going on? She straightened, the weight of her words coming into focus. Victor, I need you to prepare something. Right away. She glanced over at Lauren and Nathan, who were still waiting for her to crumble. Prepare a formal notice. I'm going to need it in case things go further. Victor paused for a moment. I assume you're talking about the deed? Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, drawing strength from the words she'd known for years. Yes, it's time. The line went quiet for just a beat. Then Victor's voice was back, firmer now. Understood. I'll have it ready, Eleanor. But you don't have to do this alone. I'll be there if you need me. Good, Eleanor replied, her voice a tight blend of control and certainty. I'll let you know. She ended the call and slid her phone into her purse, her eyes never leaving her son and his wife. The air felt charged now, like the calm before a storm. There was a shift, an unspoken understanding that this was not a negotiation, it was a revelation. Eleanor stood from the couch, her back straight. The room seemed to hold its breath, and she let it. Without a word, she moved toward the hallway, toward the place where the deed waited, where the final piece of the puzzle would fall into place. Lauren was still watching her, eyes narrowing as if trying to read her, but Eleanor didn't look back. She wasn't going to let them see her uncertainty because there was none. She was sure, unwavering. When Eleanor returned, she would not be the one asking for permission. She would be the one handing out the rules. The next step would be the most important. And it was coming. Fast. Eleanor's footsteps echoed softly down the narrow hallway, the heavy silence around her growing with each step. The house felt oddly distant now, like a place she had visited but no longer inhabited. She paused in front of the small office where the records of her life were kept, neatly filed, meticulously organized. She hadn't looked at the deed in weeks, but she didn't need to. She knew what it said. She had memorized it, the quiet weight of it sitting in the back of her mind. But today, it felt more important than ever. Today, it was her shield and sword. She slid the drawer open, the familiar scent of old paper and leather rising to meet her. It only took a moment to find it. The deed. Thick. Official, with her name stamped on the top. Eleanor Parker. Sole owner. The house was hers. Every inch. Every brick. And no one, not even Nathan or Lauren, could dispute it. Eleanor's fingers traced the edges of the document, her skin warm against the cold paper. A small thrill of satisfaction rippled through her, like the first stirrings of a storm. This was her moment. This was what she had spent years preparing for. She didn't need to wait any longer. She was ready. As she straightened, she glanced at the framed picture of Nathan on the desk, a young boy with wild hair and a crooked grin. How easily he had fallen into the comfort of complacency, allowing his wife to take charge, to demand what she thought was hers. Eleanor's eyes darkened as she thought about Lauren, her eyes full of assumptions and arrogance. But that was about to change. The phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Victor. She answered immediately. "Eleanor, everything in order?" His voice was calm, expectant. "It's done," she said, her words measured. She glanced at the deed again, the quiet confirmation she needed. "But I need you to prepare a formal notice. It's time to make this official." "I've been expecting you would say that. I'll have it ready within the hour," he replied. "But I'd recommend handling this with care. You want to make sure they understand the full extent of what you're doing. I've already decided. I'll need you to back me up if things get worse." There was a pause on the line, a sound of papers shifting. Then Victor's voice softened, almost with a trace of admiration. "You've waited a long time for this, Eleanor. You know I'll be there if you need me." Eleanor hung up the phone and set it on the desk, her fingers brushing over the deed again, reaffirming what she had always known. She was in control. It was her house, her rules. Nathan and Lauren had no idea what they were about to face, and Eleanor would enjoy watching them realize it. But she wasn't done. Not yet. She needed to ensure everything was locked down. There couldn't be any gaps. Her hand moved to her phone again, dialing Pat's number. The call was picked up immediately. "You called Victor, right?" Pat's voice was already laced with anticipation. "Done," Eleanor replied. "Now, I need you to help document everything. This is going to get messy. I want a record of every word, every gesture. I need them to understand that I'm not backing down." "I'll be there soon. We'll make sure nothing slips through the cracks," Pat assured her. "Good," Eleanor replied. "I'll be ready." As she ended the call, Eleanor couldn't help but smile. Pat was a force of nature, sharp and loyal. She had always been there when Eleanor needed her. Today, that support was crucial. Eleanor's attention shifted back to the phone once more. She dialed Sophie Kim, her trusted bank manager, who had been monitoring her financial accounts for years. Sophie answered quickly. "Everything's secure?" Eleanor asked, her voice low but clear. "Absolutely," Sophie replied, her tone measured. "I've double-checked the accounts linked to the house. There's nothing for Lauren or Nathan to touch. You're safe." Eleanor felt a weight lift off her chest. "Thank you, Sophie. I need everything to stay that way. If they try anything, I'll handle it." Sophie cut her off. "Trust me." Eleanor nodded, even though Sophie couldn't see her. Trust was the most important currency now, and Sophie had earned it. "I will." The pieces were falling into place. Eleanor felt the rush of purpose, the quiet, steady assurance that only came when everything was under control. She wasn't just going to defend her home, she was going to reclaim it, reclaim her power. But there was one thing left to do: timing. She needed to be patient. The confrontation would come, but it would happen on her terms, not theirs. Eleanor had always known when to act and when to wait, and this time, it would be no different. As she stepped out of the office, the house seemed to hum with anticipation. The air was thick with expectation, like the moments before a storm breaks. Lauren and Nathan had no idea how much their world was about to shift. Eleanor paused at the front door, staring out at the yard bathed in late afternoon light. She could already picture their faces, shocked, disbelieving. But they would come to understand. And when the time was right, Eleanor would make sure they knew that nothing could touch her now. Her grip tightened on the deed as she turned away, moving with quiet purpose toward the living room. The moment of reckoning was drawing near, and Eleanor Parker was ready. Eleanor sat in the armchair by the window, the soft hum of the house around her oddly comforting in the silence. Outside, the shadows lengthened, stretching across the porch and into the yard, as the evening sky shifted to hues of purple and gold. The house, her house, had stood through decades of change. Her change, her choices. It was a reminder that time, no matter how long or unpredictable, always bowed to those who knew how to wield it. She was calm, poised, every inch the woman who had spent a lifetime in control. It wasn't her first confrontation, but this one felt different. This one would make history. Across the room, Lauren stood with her arms crossed, her posture a rigid line of defiance. She wasn't just standing in the doorway, she was blocking it. The threshold that once symbolized Eleanor's home, now a symbol of Lauren's misplaced authority. Eleanor could feel the younger woman's stare burning into her, the tension thick as Lauren's eyes darted from side to side, clearly trying to make sense of why her mother-in-law wasn't caving under the pressure. Nathan lingered behind Lauren, his eyes darting nervously between his wife and mother. He hadn't said much since the confrontation began, and his silence spoke volumes. His passive nature always made him the follower, the one who deferred to his wife, never one to assert himself. He seemed uncomfortable, unsure of how to navigate the growing storm in his own living room. But even his discomfort wouldn't sway Eleanor. Not now. Pat, standing quietly in the corner of the room, was observing. As always, she was a steady presence, watching and waiting for the moment to strike. Her eyes flickered to Eleanor's, a silent agreement passing between them. Pat had seen Eleanor face far worse, far more dangerous battles, and she knew this was nothing more than a simple power play. It wasn't about who had the loudest voice or the strongest will. It was about who had the right to make the rules. Victor had already reviewed everything, and though Eleanor didn't need to glance at her phone to know he was ready, she did anyway. His message was simple. The deed and financial documents are secure. You're protected. It was just another reassurance, another layer of her safety net in place. She knew there would be no legal missteps, no loopholes that Lauren could exploit. It was all airtight. Eleanor took a slow sip from her cup of tea, savoring the warmth as it slid down her throat. She allowed herself the briefest of moments to feel the calmness wash over her, to remind herself that she wasn't just acting on impulse. Every movement, every word had been carefully planned. There was no room for mistakes. Lauren shifted impatiently, her foot tapping lightly against the floor, her eyes narrowing further. I'm not going to stand here and pretend like we can't settle this like adults, Lauren said, her voice sharp with thinly veiled disdain. You don't get to just sit here, unchallenged, while you... Eleanor raised a hand, cutting off the tirade. The action was small, almost imperceptible, but it had the immediate effect of silencing the room. The weight of Eleanor's presence wasn't something to be argued with. Not now. Her gaze slid over to Nathan, who seemed more a spectator than a participant in his own life. His eyes flickered to her, then quickly down to the floor, unsure of how to navigate the battle that was about to unfold in front of him. He had always been passive, avoiding confrontation at all costs, and it was clear that he had no idea how to handle this. Lauren, Eleanor said, her voice smooth, controlled. You've made your point, but I don't need to justify myself to you. She let the words sink in, allowing them to settle between them like a heavy fog. Pat's eyes stayed fixed on Lauren, watching her face as her expression shifted from irritation to confusion. The arrogance that had once been so assured in Lauren's stance was beginning to falter, just slightly. Eleanor could almost see it, the first cracks in Lauren's armor. It would take only a little longer for the rest to follow. Victor's voice echoed in Eleanor's mind, reminding her that everything was in place. The deed, the financial protections. There were no gaps, no weak spots. Everything was locked tight. And Lauren? She had no legal standing, not even a foot to stand on. Eleanor was going to enjoy watching that truth unfold. Eleanor sat back in her chair, the act of doing so almost regal. She didn't need to jump into the fray. She didn't need to argue. She simply needed to remain steady, to remain in control. And when the time came, she would show them exactly how this was going to unfold. She met Lauren's gaze again, this time with a calmness that bordered on almost unholy. "You think you have power here. You think you can make demands. But you're forgetting one thing," she said slowly. "This house, this land, it's mine. It always has been. And nothing you say or do will change that." The room seemed to hold its breath. Lauren's lips parted. Her words caught somewhere between denial and shock, and Nathan shifted uncomfortably behind her. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. His eyes were wide, his mind struggling to catch up with the reality unfolding around him. The silence stretched. The moment hung heavy, thick with tension, and Eleanor didn't let it break. This was the point, the shift, the moment when everything changed. And just as the weight of the truth began to settle in, Eleanor felt it. A brief, almost imperceptible shift. The air changed, the tension mounting, the eyes in the room focused solely on her. She was no longer just a mother. She was no longer just a woman in a chair. She was a force, and they would feel it soon enough. But Lauren wasn't done yet. The battle wasn't over. Eleanor leaned forward, lips curling slightly. "Shall we begin?" Eleanor's hand hovered over the armrest for a long moment. The air seemed to press in on her, thick and heavy, but she remained still. The tea had long since grown cold, forgotten. Everything in the room, the furniture, the air, even the dust motes floating lazily in the slanted sunlight, felt like a slow, deliberate rhythm building towards something inevitable. She stood up. The movement was fluid, controlled, deliberate. She was the embodiment of calm, every muscle relaxed, every gesture purposeful. As she straightened to her full height, Eleanor could feel the tension in the room shift, like a gust of wind through an open door. Lauren's eyes followed her every move, sharp with suspicion, but she didn't say anything. No retort, no demand. The room was quiet, holding its breath. Eleanor's fingers brushed against the top of the desk, the spot where the deed lay, waiting. The weight of it, though light in her hand, was everything she needed it to be. She lifted it slowly, watching Lauren's face for the first sign of doubt. It came almost immediately. Lauren's eyes flicked from Eleanor's face to the paper in her hand, a flicker of confusion crossing her features. Nathan, still standing behind his wife, leaned slightly forward, his brow furrowing as if he could already sense something was shifting. He knew, somewhere deep inside, that the stakes had just risen. With a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh, Eleanor took a step forward. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to wave the deed in their faces. The mere act of her standing up, of holding the document, was enough to make Lauren shift on her feet, unease creeping into her stance. Eleanor raised her voice, just enough for it to carry. "This house," she said, her words smooth, deliberate, and final. "This home, the land you thought was yours, it's mine. Legally, Irrevocably, it is mine. For a moment, the words seemed to hang in the air, almost like a strange wind stirring the dust. Lauren's face froze, her expression shifting from defiance to confusion, then quickly to disbelief. She took a small step back, but Eleanor could see the shock breaking through. Lauren had been prepared for a fight, perhaps a lengthy discussion, a tug of war over what she believed was her due. But not this. Not the calm revelation of a truth so firmly grounded in law that it could not be ignored. Nathan looked at the deed now, then at his mother, and for the first time, his expression betrayed a hint of realization. It was as though the scales had fallen from his eyes, the fog of denial clearing. The man who had always deferred to his wife, who had shrugged off the weight of his mother's authority, now saw the reality he had long ignored. Eleanor held her ground. She didn't need to explain herself. She had no need for further words. The deed, the undeniable proof, was in her hand. And now, she would let that silence do all the talking. She could see the internal struggle playing out across Nathan's face as he processed the truth of what she'd just said. His eyes flickered from the deed to his wife and back again, trying to reconcile the life he thought he knew with this new, overwhelming reality. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke, but Eleanor could hear the tremor in it. What? What does this mean? His question, though simple, carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken realizations. Pat, observing from the corner, had been quiet, but she wasn't blind to the shift in dynamics. She was writing, taking notes in the margin of her ever-present notebook. She knew that what was unfolding wasn't just a confrontation. It was the moment Eleanor had been preparing for. This was the part where everything changed. Eleanor didn't look at Pat, but she felt the connection. Pat's pen paused briefly before continuing its rhythm. The confirmation would come later. For now, Eleanor could feel the moment stretching, like the stillness of a storm before it broke. Victor's voice came, soft but resolute, in Eleanor's mind. The deed is valid, Eleanor. All financial and legal rights are secure. The property, the funds, everything is exactly as it should be. Eleanor closed her eyes for just a second, savoring the feeling of complete control. When she opened them again, she glanced at Nathan, then Lauren, whose face was now flushed with the early signs of panic. She didn't need to say anything more. Lauren took a step back, her eyes darting between the deed and Eleanor's unwavering gaze, as if hoping for some crack in the armor, some sign that this was all a misunderstanding. But Eleanor didn't move, didn't waver. She just stood there, letting the truth sink in. Nathan's voice was a whisper now, barely audible. I didn't know. The words trailed off, unfinished, as the full weight of his lack of authority settled around him. He had never taken the reins. And now, the reins had slipped from his hands altogether. Lauren, desperate to regain some control, opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. Eleanor could see the flicker of realization in her eyes, the dawning, terrible truth that she had no power here, no claim, no leverage. The house, everything they had fought for, wasn't even theirs. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice like silk, smooth and cutting through the stillness. You don't have the right to dictate anything in this house, Lauren. It was never yours to control. The room was deathly quiet, the weight of Eleanor's words hanging like a thick fog, impossible to ignore. Lauren looked as if she had just been struck, the color draining from her face as she backed away, trying to gather her bearings. And Nathan? He had no words left. There was nothing more to say. The moment had arrived. Eleanor's victory was not just a momentary one, it was final. And Not even their combined arrogance could take it from her now. And as Eleanor watched them retreat into stunned silence, a small, satisfied smile curled at the corner of her lips. It was her house, her rules, and it always had been. The air in the living room felt heavy, thick with the weight of Eleanor's words, and yet she remained perfectly poised. Every motion, every glance seemed measured and deliberate. Her hands were steady as she returned the deed to the table, the crisp edges of the document catching the low light of the room. There was no hurry, no need to rush. She simply stood there, her eyes unwavering, watching the reactions unfold. Her guests, who had been silently observing the exchange, exchanged wary glances. Some tried to look away, not wanting to get caught in the middle of the unfolding family drama, but they could feel the shift. There was no denying it. Eleanor had taken control, and in that one moment, she had redefined the entire dynamic of the room. Lauren, still stunned by the revelation, took a step back, trying to regain some semblance of composure. But the cracks in her confidence were undeniable. Her posture had faltered, her arms no longer crossed in defiance, but hanging loosely at her sides. The air around her felt heavy with the weight of her realization. The power she thought she had, the rent she demanded, the control she'd assumed, none of it meant anything now. She opened her mouth to speak, her words tentative, almost pleading, but Eleanor didn't even glance her way. It was a subtle dismissal, a calm refusal to engage with someone who had long overstated their importance. Eleanor's lack of response was more powerful than any rebuttal she could have given. Lauren faltered again, her mouth snapping shut as the truth settled in. The realization hit her slowly, like the creeping tide of a storm. She couldn't challenge the deed. She couldn't enforce rent. It was all meaningless. Eleanor's authority wasn't just a matter of opinion, it was the law. And no matter how much she tried to twist the situation, no matter how many arguments she presented, there was nothing she could do to change it. Nathan, who had been silent for far too long, looked between his wife and his mother, his face pale, his jaw set in stunned disbelief. It wasn't just shock at Eleanor's calm resolve, it was the dawning horror that his passive acceptance of Lauren's demands had left him powerless in his own life. His mother had kept him at arm's length for years, but this, the magnitude of her control, was something he had never truly understood. He turned to his wife, his voice small and unsure. "Lauren, I didn't know. I didn't know it was like this." There was no answer from her, only the dull thudding of her realization settling deep inside her. Her eyes moved from Nathan to Eleanor and back again, as though hoping for something, anything, that would validate the life she had built on the shaky foundation of assumptions. Pat, observing in her corner of the room, allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to tug at the corner of her lips. She had watched Eleanor navigate far more complex situations with ease, but there was something satisfying in seeing the look on Lauren's face, the mounting humiliation she could no longer suppress. She was losing, and Pat had always known that Eleanor would win. She was a strategist, always playing the long game, waiting for the perfect moment. And now, as Lauren's pride deflated before her eyes, Pat couldn't help but savor the quiet justice unfolding. It wasn't just about the house or the money. It was about control, about knowing exactly when and how to hold the reins. Victor's voice came through Eleanor's phone, as calm as ever, but with a hint of approval. "Eleanor, everything is in order. The deed is safe. The financial protections are intact. You've got everything locked down. No one can touch it. Eleanor's eyes briefly flicked to her phone, her lips curling into a small, satisfied smile. She had always been prepared for this moment, even if her family hadn't been. She was the master of her own world now, and nothing, not even her son's misguided loyalty to his wife, could change that. The room seemed to contract in on itself, the air thick with a quiet tension that none of them could escape. Eleanor could feel it, the subtle shift in the energy, the understanding that everything had changed. It wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about power, real, undeniable power. And Lauren had no idea how to wrest it back. Nathan's eyes lingered on his mother, a flicker of something, perhaps respect, perhaps fear, shifting beneath his usual passivity. He had always let his wife take the lead, always followed her commands. But this moment had cracked something inside him. He was no longer the boy in the picture on the mantel. He wasn't the man who had let his wife make decisions for him. He was an adult now, standing at the edge of a cliff, realizing just how far he had fallen. Lauren's shoulders slumped slightly as the last of her bravado bled out. She had nothing left to say. Her words had failed her. Her authority had failed her. And for the first time in this entire exchange, she seemed small. Not just physically, but in every way that mattered. Eleanor had taken everything from her, the illusion of control, the power over her own fate, and in its place stood a quiet, undeniable truth. This house, this family, was Eleanor's to command. A thick silence stretched across the room, and then, almost imperceptibly, Eleanor took a step back, a soft breath escaping her lips as she finally allowed herself to relax. She had done it. She had won. Lauren, defeated and humiliated, turned away. Nathan stood frozen, still trying to piece together the fragments of his shattered understanding. But Eleanor? She was calm, composed, already looking ahead. Her victory was complete, and nothing would ever be the same. But as Eleanor watched them retreat into their silence, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. They had no idea yet what kind of force they had awoken. And in the quiet satisfaction of her victory, Eleanor knew. She was far from finished. The house had never felt quieter. The tension that hung in the air was palpable, stretching its fingers into every corner, every forgotten nook. Eleanor stood by the mantel, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the polished wood. The evening sun cast a golden hue over the room, but it didn't feel warm. It felt distant, as if the world outside had become irrelevant in the wake of her victory. Her phone buzzed again, and she didn't have to look to know who it was. Sophie. The bank manager had been one of her most trusted allies, and now, more than ever, her vigilance was needed. "Everything secure?" Eleanor asked, her voice smooth and composed, a far cry from the chaos swirling in the room behind her. "It's all under control," Sophie's voice came through, calm and precise. "I've ensured that all accounts linked to the house are locked down. No one can access the funds, not even Lauren. You're protected." Eleanor nodded to herself. It was a small but critical reassurance. The house, the land, it was hers. But the financial leverage that Lauren had tried to claim could have been a more dangerous weapon. Eleanor had made sure that every precaution was in place. Across the room, Lauren was visibly twitching, shifting from foot to foot, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. It wasn't just the deed that had been yanked from her control. Now the financial accounts, everything tied to this house, every potential advantage, had slipped from her grasp as well. Lauren turned toward Nathan, her voice strained but still dripping with the faintest trace of arrogance. Nathan, we need to do something about this. We can't just let her. But Nathan didn't respond. He was staring at his mother, his gaze long and unbroken, as if trying to comprehend everything that had unfolded. The man who had spent years deferring to his wife, the one who had avoided conflict with the woman who had raised him, now stood frozen in place, helpless. Eleanor could see the shift in his eyes, the slow realization dawning. He hadn't known his mother was this strong. He hadn't understood the extent of her power, of her quiet, implacable control. But now, there it was, clear and undeniable. And in that moment, as his wife faltered, he was finally forced to confront his own passivity. Pat, standing off to the side, took a subtle step forward, her gaze sharp as she watched Lauren's futile attempt to regain control. She'd seen this kind of thing before. She had seen women with all the power in the world crumble when they realized it had been an illusion. Lauren wasn't used to losing, not like this. But Pat knew that the discomfort on her face would only grow. Eleanor had built her strategy too carefully to be outwitted by someone like Lauren. Victor's voice came in next, steady and reassuring. Eleanor, the financial protections are permanent. Everything is locked down. Even if Lauren tries to make a move, it won't work. She's out of options. Eleanor allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Though her eyes never wavered from Lauren's increasingly frazzled face. The confirmation felt like the final piece snapping into place. The deed was secured. The money was secured. Nothing could touch her now. She had done what she needed to do. Lauren, growing more desperate by the second, reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she tapped the screen. No doubt trying to get in contact with some lawyer, some financial advisor, anyone who could make sense of what had just happened. She had no idea how thoroughly Eleanor had planned every aspect of this. Eleanor's voice cut through the quiet, calm, but firm. Lauren, you can't manipulate the accounts. You can't do anything. It's done. You're wasting your time. Lauren's hand dropped to her side, the phone slipping from her grip as her shoulders slumped. Eleanor's words, so simple and direct, had stripped away the final vestiges of hope Lauren had clung to. She wasn't in control. She hadn't been in control for a long time. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Nathan's gaze never left his mother, his mouth opening and closing, as though the words he needed to speak were locked behind a door he couldn't find the key to. His eyes were wide, his hands trembling slightly as he seemed to grasp just how little power he actually had. He had been living in a world of illusions, and now the walls had crumbled around him. Eleanor didn't give him time to process. She didn't need to. The moment had passed, and now it was time to move forward. She took a slow, deliberate step toward the door of the living room, her heels clicking softly against the floor. As she passed Pat, their eyes met for a brief, knowing moment. Pat didn't need to say anything. Eleanor could feel the weight of her approval, the quiet satisfaction that mirrored her own. Eleanor turned her gaze back to Lauren, who was now standing at the edge of the room, a shadow of her former self. Her face, once flushed with arrogance, was now pale, drained of color. "You've lost," Eleanor said softly, almost as a whisper. "There's nothing left to fight for. It was never yours to control." Lauren opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Instead, she simply turned away, her shoulders hunched as she walked out of the room, defeated, broken. Nathan, still rooted in place, seemed to hesitate for a moment longer. Then, in the faintest of movements, he nodded, barely perceptible, but it was there. A silent acknowledgement of what had just happened, and perhaps a hint of something deeper, a recognition that the power had always been in his mother's hands, and he had simply never seen it. Eleanor's fingers brushed lightly against the door frame as she stepped into the hallway. The house felt quieter now, but the silence was different. It wasn't oppressive. It was victorious. She paused for a moment, allowing the quiet to settle around her before she took another step forward. The game wasn't over yet, but it was hers to play. And this time, she would make the rules. The guests in the room had begun to feel the weight of the moment. Their attention was no longer on the luxurious decor or the golden light of the setting sun. Every one of them, whether directly involved or not, was drawn into the thick tension that hung in the air. The standoff between Eleanor and Lauren had shifted something deep within the room, a seismic change none of them had expected, least of all, Lauren herself. Eleanor stood tall, poised, almost serene in her victory. Her eyes swept briefly over the faces of the guests who had been silent witnesses to the exchange, noting their subtle expressions of disbelief, discomfort, and, in some cases, admiration. They had expected a different kind of confrontation, perhaps a messy argument, a verbal sparring match. But they had not expected this. Not this quiet strength. Not this calm authority. Nathan, still reeling from the confrontation, cleared his throat, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to speak, his words fumbling out before he could fully formulate them. "Look, Mom, I don't think you understand," he began, attempting to steady himself as he turned to face his mother. His eyes darted briefly to Lauren, who now stood at the edge of the room, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She wasn't even looking at him anymore. Her gaze was fixed on the floor, her face pale with the brutal realization of what had just transpired. Nathan swallowed hard, his words turning into a feeble defense. "Lauren and we need to figure something out. This isn't the way we should be handling things." Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even move a muscle except to slightly tilt her head, the faintest of smiles tugging at the corner of her lips. "Nathan," she said, her voice low and measured, "you've already made your choice, and you've seen the results of it." He opened his mouth to argue again, but the words caught in his throat. He knew she was right, and somewhere deep inside, he understood that the moment he had been avoiding, the moment of confrontation with his own inaction, had come crashing down on him. The truth was out, and there was no going back. He could try to defend Lauren, but in doing so, he would only be protecting the very system that had kept him passive, that had kept him from seeing the depth of his own complicity. He closed his mouth, his shoulders sagging as he turned away from his mother and walked to Lauren's side. There was nothing more he could say. No more excuses. The look on his face said it all. He hadn't just underestimated his mother. He had underestimated the power she had quietly amassed over the years, the authority she had carried without ever needing to flaunt it. Pat, ever the silent observer, allowed herself a small smile. She'd known from the beginning that Eleanor's strength wasn't in loud declarations or threats. It was in her quiet confidence, her ability to remain calm, poised, no matter the storm around her. As the room continued to simmer in a mixture of tension and disbelief, Pat made her way over to the window, her pen still moving steadily across the notebook she had been keeping since the moment Eleanor had stood up. She didn't need to write down the details. This was the turning point, the moment everyone would remember. Victor, sitting at the edge of the room, was calm as always, his eyes never leaving the family. He wasn't just observing the social dynamics. He was ensuring that everything Every word spoken, every document, was backed by solid legal standing. He knew that Eleanor's victory wasn't just about this moment. It was about securing her future, her control over her life and her assets. And from where he sat, everything was airtight. Nothing could touch her now. Lauren remained silent, her embarrassment growing with every passing second. The more she tried to gather herself, the more the weight of her own defeat pressed on her. She wasn't used to losing. She wasn't used to being outplayed. The pride that had once burned so brightly in her now flickered, dimmed by the realization that she had no claim to anything in this room, nothing that she could demand or manipulate. Eleanor could feel the shift in the atmosphere. It was subtle at first, the way the guests' eyes flicked away from the confrontation, the way their postures straightened as they tried to regain some sense of normalcy. But the moment had irrevocably changed everything. They were no longer in the presence of a woman they could push around. They were witnessing the quiet dominance of someone who had played the game for years and now, finally, was holding the winning hand. And then, as if sensing the turning tide, Eleanor allowed her smile to spread slightly. It was small, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't paying attention, but to those who were, it spoke volumes. She had won. And she wasn't just enjoying the victory, she was savoring the moment. The calm satisfaction of knowing she had navigated the chaos and emerged victorious. Not through aggression, but through patience and strategy. "I trust that we won't have any further misunderstandings," Eleanor said, her voice cool and final. She didn't need to say more. Her words, already sharp and deliberate, hung in the air, forcing everyone to absorb the weight of what had just happened. Lauren's face was now a mixture of disbelief and humiliation. She opened her mouth, perhaps to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, she simply nodded slowly, turning her gaze downward. She was beaten, and she knew it. Nathan's gaze, still heavy with regret, flickered from his wife to his mother. His world had just been upended, and now the path forward was unclear. But one thing was certain. Eleanor had shown him, without question, who truly held the power in their family. As the last of the guests shifted uneasily, the silence in the room settled once again, and Eleanor stood there, unshaken, unbroken. The game was over, and she had claimed her victory. But even as she watched the others withdraw into their own quiet corners, a part of her knew this was just the beginning, and nothing would ever be the same again. The silence in the room was no longer a mere absence of sound. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness, the kind that made each breath feel like an echo in an empty chamber. The guests, who had once murmured among themselves, now sat stiffly in their seats, their eyes darting between Eleanor and the others. No one seemed sure of what to do next. Eleanor, however, was calm, unwavering in her quiet authority. She stood at the center of the room, not as the matriarch of the family, but as something far more imposing. A woman who had just rewritten the rules, effortlessly asserting control over everything around her. It wasn't just the house or the financial assets. It was everything. It was the power she had taken back, the power she had always quietly held, but now it was undeniable. Nathan shifted on his feet, still standing beside Lauren. His eyes flicked from Eleanor to the other guests and back again, as if searching for a way out, a way to reconcile the new reality with the life he had always known. But the truth was unavoidable now. The more he tried to rationalize, the more impossible it became to ignore the weight of his mother's victory. Lauren, standing a few steps behind him, looked smaller than she had before. Her shoulders, once held with defiant pride, were now slumped, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She didn't speak. She couldn't. There was nothing left for her to say. The power she had once assumed was hers had been stripped away, and with it, the influence she'd hoped to wield over Nathan. The family was no longer under her sway. Eleanor's voice broke the silence, low and steady, yet it carried a finality that left no room for debate. From now on, all household and financial matters will be handled through me. There will be no more confusion on that front. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to make grand gestures. The weight of her words, delivered with quiet precision, carried more authority than any shout or accusation ever could. Nathan shifted again, his discomfort obvious. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but the words faltered before they could leave his lips. The realization had settled within him. There was no room left for him to challenge his mother. Not now. Victor, seated in the corner, was the first to break the tension that had thickened in the room. His voice, typically steady, now had a layer of respect for the woman who had played the situation with a master's hand. "Eleanor," he said, nodding in her direction, "all legal and financial protections are permanent. The accounts, the deed, everything is secure under your control. There's no turning back for anyone." The confirmation, though not unexpected, still landed with the same weight. Eleanor glanced at Victor, giving him a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't just about the house. It wasn't just about the assets. It was about ensuring that no one could challenge her position again. No one could take what was hers. Pat, ever the observer, stood in the corner of the room, her eyes locked on Eleanor. She had witnessed many battles fought, some won and others lost, but this was different. Eleanor's victory wasn't just about securing property or wealth, it was about reclaiming control, something that had been slowly eroded over the years by her son and daughter-in-law's assumptions. Pat made no move to speak, but her eyes conveyed the quiet admiration she felt for her old friend. Eleanor had executed this with a level of patience that few could match. She had bided her time, playing the long game, waiting for the perfect moment to assert her authority. That moment had come, and now the pieces were falling into place. The guests, too, could not help but observe the subtle power Eleanor wielded. Some, perhaps the more observant, recognized the quiet strength that had been behind her every move. They could see that the house wasn't just hers by legal right. It was hers in every way that mattered. She had carved out a space where no one could touch her, no one could take from her again. As the room settled back into a quiet rhythm, Eleanor allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. It had been a long time coming, this reclaiming of her life, this taking back of control. She hadn't acted out of anger or spite. She hadn't lashed out at the people who had underestimated her. No, this had been about patience, timing, and most of all, strategy. She had been calm, measured, and unstoppable. Her eyes moved over the room one last time, scanning the faces of the guests who still lingered. They had witnessed a shift in the balance of power, and they would remember this moment. It would be one they would talk about long after they left. And though the confrontation with Lauren and Nathan was over, Eleanor knew that this was just the beginning. The family dynamics had been altered forever, and now the game was hers to continue. With a final glance toward Nathan and Lauren, who were still standing, absorbed in their own quiet shock, Eleanor straightened. She had done what needed to be done. There would be no more waiting, no more pretending. The rules had been rewritten. And now, Eleanor Parker was in control. The room was heavy with the quiet hum of disbelief as the guests, some still trying to process what they had just witnessed, exchanged furtive glances. Eleanor stood at the center, her posture unyielding, a silent command in every inch of her. The power she had so effortlessly asserted over the house, over her son and daughter-in-law, was now palpable in the air itself. Lauren, still standing at the edge of the room, looked like a figure from a forgotten photograph. Small, fading, unsure of where she belonged in the space anymore. Her face, flushed with embarrassment, refused to meet the eyes of the people around her. She had been a queen in her own mind, ruling the house with silent authority. Now she was reduced to a mere shadow, clinging to a life she no longer controlled. The guests had seen it all, how Eleanor had effortlessly taken back what had been hers, not with a shout or a tantrum, but with quiet precision. Now, as they stood in the stillness of the aftermath, they couldn't help but whisper to one another, their voices low but thick with admiration for Eleanor's grace under fire. They had witnessed the collapse of the confidence that Lauren had once worn so proudly. It wasn't just the confrontation they had watched. It was the unveiling of Eleanor's true power, the power that no one had truly acknowledged before. Pat, standing by the window, allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. She had always known that Eleanor was a force to be reckoned with, but today, her friend had shown just how much control she truly had. Pat didn't need to celebrate loudly. She didn't need to boast. The quiet smile tugging at the corner of her lips was enough. This wasn't just about the house or the money. It was about a woman reclaiming her rightful place in her own life, asserting her authority over a family that had long underestimated her. Victor, who had remained seated through the entire ordeal, now stood up, his expression unreadable but firm. His voice broke the silence as he turned to Eleanor, his tone reverberating with the weight of his role in all of this. All legal and financial protections remain intact. Everything is as it should be, Eleanor. There's no turning back for anyone, not even Lauren. His eyes briefly flicked toward the woman standing like a defeated statue at the far end of the room. Eleanor nodded once, her smile small but satisfied. She didn't need to hear the confirmation. It was a formality now, a reassurance for the others in the room. She had known from the beginning that her position was secure. The deed, the accounts. Her control over everything was bulletproof. She had played the long game, and now it was her victory to savor. As the guests shifted uneasily in their seats, the murmurs grew louder, though no one dared to speak above a whisper. Eleanor's reputation had been quietly but profoundly cemented in their minds. They could no longer ignore the quiet authority that had always been there, hidden beneath a calm, unassuming exterior. Now, the reality was clear. This house was hers. The family dynamics had shifted forever, and no one would challenge her authority again. One guest, a woman Eleanor had known for years but never considered a close confidant, leaned toward her companion. Her voice barely audible, but sharp with awe, she said, "Did you see that? She didn't even raise her voice, and yet she owns everything." There was admiration in her words, though it carried a slight edge of envy. Another guest, one who had always seen Eleanor as just the quiet, reserved matriarch of the family, couldn't help but nod in agreement. It's like watching a master strategist in action. She knew exactly when to move, when to reveal her hand. And now, look, there's nothing left for anyone else to take. Eleanor heard the whispers, though she did not react to them. She didn't need to. The recognition was there, in the way the guests now looked at her. no longer as a passive player in her own life, but as someone to be reckoned with. She had earned their respect, but she hadn't had to ask for it. It had come to her, as naturally as the air she breathed. Lauren's humiliation was palpable, and for a moment, Eleanor almost felt a flicker of something like sympathy. But it quickly passed. Lauren had brought this upon herself, had spent years trying to control what wasn't hers to control. This was simply the inevitable consequence of that arrogance. Eleanor wasn't about to pity her for her failure. Nathan, too, had begun to realize the depth of his own miscalculation. He had stood by, unsure, passive, for so long, and now the weight of the moment was dawning on him. The man who had thought he could balance his allegiance to both his wife and his mother was now standing at a crossroads. The recognition that his mother's control over the family was no longer in question was one he hadn't anticipated. And now it was clear. He had no say. Eleanor had already won. For Eleanor, there was no great triumph in the moment. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her plan had been executed flawlessly. It wasn't about the victory itself. It was about the years of strategy that had brought her to this point. The waiting, the careful decisions, the moments of silence when no one was looking, those had all led her here. And now it was her time to stand in the fullness of that power, to let the world, family, friends, even strangers, see that Eleanor Parker was no longer someone to be underestimated. As the last of the guests began to filter out of the room, the tension slowly ebbing away, Eleanor stood still, alone for the first time in what felt like hours. Her gaze wandered briefly to Nathan and Lauren, who remained at the edge of the room, like two figures in a world that no longer made sense to them. They had lost, and there was no getting it back. Eleanor allowed herself a final quiet breath, savoring the taste of the victory she had earned. She had set everything in motion, and now the world, her world, would bend to her will. But as she turned toward the door, her mind raced forward. This was just the beginning. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun, and Eleanor Parker was just getting started. The quiet hum of the afternoon settled over Eleanor's home like a blanket, the stillness welcome after the storm of the past few days. The light filtered softly through the large windows, casting warm, golden streaks across the polished floors. Outside, the sounds of savannah, distant birds, the rustle of leaves in the breeze seemed to fade into the background, as if the world itself had paused in reverence of the shift that had just occurred within these walls. Eleanor sat in her favorite chair by the window, the one that overlooked the sprawling garden she had lovingly tended for years. The chair was old, worn in places, but it was comfortable, familiar, just like this house. She wasn't worried about the future now. She had secured it with every step she'd taken, every move she'd made, carefully planned and executed. The house, the assets, the legacy, they were all hers, and no one, not Nathan nor Lauren, could take them from her now. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor allowed herself to simply enjoy the peace she had fought for. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, and her gaze drifted to the garden beyond the window, where a few late-blooming flowers swayed gently in the breeze. It had been a long road to get here, but she was here now, in control, and the weight of the victory, while heavy, felt good. Nathan and Lauren, somewhere in the house, would not be able to disturb her today. There was no more arguing, no more demands, no more pleas for compromise. They had been silenced, not by confrontation, but by the simple power of her quiet authority. The door to the study opened and Victor entered, his usual stoic expression now softened by a look of approval. He had been Eleanor's trusted attorney for years, and though she hadn't needed his services as much in the past, he had always been there when she needed him most. Today, his role had been crucial, but it was more than just legal guidance. It was his unwavering presence that had reassured her when things seemed uncertain. "All legal filings are permanent," he said, standing just inside the door, his voice low and steady. "There's nothing left for anyone to challenge. Everything has been sealed." He paused, and Eleanor could see the respect in his eyes. "No one can touch this house. No one can touch what's yours." Eleanor nodded slowly, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. "I knew it would be." She hadn't needed to hear the confirmation from him, but she appreciated it all the same. She had taken care of everything, ensured that there were no cracks, no loose ends. The house, the estate, the funds, all of it was protected, irrevocably under her control. Victor hesitated for just a moment before speaking again. "Is there anything else you need from me today, Eleanor?" She shook her head, her gaze turning once again to the garden. "No. Thank you, Victor. I have everything I need." Pat, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room, observing everything, spoke up from her chair. "You've done it, Eleanor." Her voice was soft but filled with a quiet sense of pride. "You've made sure everything is in its place." Eleanor turned her gaze to her old friend, and for the first time, a deeper, more genuine smile spread across her face. "I've only just begun." Pat smiled back, but her eyes were knowing. She had seen it all, from the subtle manipulations to the final graceful execution of Eleanor's plan. "I know, but for now, you've earned this peace." Eleanor's mind wandered to the next steps, the next pieces of the puzzle. She had already begun planning, even as she sat in the stillness of the room. The future wasn't just about maintaining control over what she had secured. It was about making sure that what she had built would endure. She would start by ensuring that her charitable allocations were finalized. Eleanor had always believed in using her wealth for good, but she would do so on her own terms. It wasn't just about giving. It was about creating a legacy that would last beyond the family squabbles, beyond the whispers of those who thought they could take from her. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps. Nathan appeared in the doorway, looking uncertain, almost lost in the quiet of the room. He hesitated, not quite sure if he should enter, but Eleanor's gaze met his, steady and unwavering. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply stood there, eyes downcast, caught in the same uncomfortable silence that had enveloped him since the confrontation. Eleanor knew he was still grappling with everything, the loss of control, the sudden realization that he had no say in the matter anymore. "I know you're upset," Eleanor said, her voice as calm as ever. "But this is how it is now. This is my house, my legacy. You've made your choices, Nathan. And now, you must live with them." He looked up then, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time, Eleanor saw something shift in his expression. It wasn't anger. It wasn't resentment. It was understanding. He hadn't been prepared for this moment, hadn't known his mother was capable of such a shift in power. But now, the weight of it was undeniable. Lauren, still standing in the background, said nothing. Her gaze, though, was a study in silent defeat. She had expected to rule, but the reign had been taken from her without a single word of protest. And now, she knew, there was nothing left to claim. Eleanor allowed a brief moment of quiet to pass before standing up. She was done with the conversation. It wasn't her place to make amends. Not now. Not when everything had been set in motion. Her hands rested lightly on the desk, fingers tapping a steady rhythm as she prepared herself for the next steps. For the first time in a long time, the peace she had longed for was hers. And she wasn't about to let anyone take it from her. As she glanced out of the window once more, the sunlight dancing on the garden outside, Eleanor felt a flicker of anticipation. She had done what needed to be done, but the world beyond these walls was still waiting for her. And the game, it seemed, was only just beginning. The afternoon light began to soften, casting long, gentle shadows across the room. Eleanor remained seated by the window, her eyes unfocused as she stared out at the garden. The serenity of the scene before her felt almost surreal after the storm that had raged through her home. The echoes of that confrontation were still there, but they no longer held the power they once did. The power was hers now. Her mind wandered, not to the triumph she had just claimed, but to the deeper currents that ran through her family, the undercurrents of entitlement that had allowed Nathan and Lauren to assume they could control her life. For years she had watched them, seen how they took what they wanted, made demands as though the world owed them something, as though they were entitled to everything, simply by virtue of their relationship to her. It was in the way Lauren had assumed she could claim rent on a house that wasn't hers, in the way Nathan had blindly deferred, always standing behind his wife, never questioning her influence over him. Eleanor sighed softly, her fingers gently tapping against the armrest of the chair. This was not a victory against them alone. This was a victory for herself, a reclaiming of everything they had so casually thought they could take from her. She hadn't asked for much in life, but what she had earned. And it was hers. By right. Not by inheritance, not by marriage, but by the sheer force of her will, her patience, and her careful, quiet planning. Footsteps echoed behind her, and Nathan appeared in the doorway, standing as he had before, hesitant, uncertain. Eleanor didn't look at him immediately. She didn't need to. The weight of what he had witnessed was clear. For the first time, he wasn't just her son. He was a man who had watched his own illusions crumble. He was no longer the passive observer, the one who let others make decisions for him. He was now the one who had to live with the consequences of those decisions. "I understand now," Nathan said quietly, his voice steady but thick with the weight of realization. He paused for a moment, then added, "I was wrong to let things go this far." Eleanor's gaze finally met his, her eyes unwavering. He was standing in the threshold, a man who had spent his life running from confrontation, but now there was no escape from the truth. "You've learned a lesson today," she said softly, but her voice carried the gravity of 1,000 unspoken words. "But it's a lesson you should have learned long ago." Nathan nodded, his expression tight, as though he was still trying to digest the enormity of what had happened. Eleanor didn't offer him comfort. She didn't offer him anything. This was his reckoning, not hers. Lauren appeared behind him, her posture smaller than it had been, her eyes cast downward as though she couldn't bear the weight of the room any longer. She didn't speak, didn't dare. Her defeat was evident in the way she held herself. She had thought she could play the game, but she had been outmatched. Not by strength, but by strategy. Not by force, but by control. Pat entered the room quietly, her presence as measured as ever. She glanced at the scene before her, the defeated pair standing at the threshold, and Eleanor, still as a statue, watching them like a hawk. Pat gave a small, knowing smile. She had seen this before, the slow but inevitable realization that Eleanor was not a woman to be underestimated. Victor stood nearby, a silent sentinel as always. His voice was the calm, professional anchor in the room. "All filings remain intact," he confirmed, his tone steady. "There is no room for any challenges. Everything is legally secured. There are no holes left." Eleanor nodded, her face impassive, though inside there was a deep satisfaction. The pieces had all fallen into place. She had built a fortress around herself, and no one would be able to breach it. As the guests began to filter out of the room, whispering to each other, Eleanor's eyes lingered on Nathan and Lauren, who still stood in the same place, as if waiting for something to change. But nothing would change. The world had shifted, and they hadn't realized it yet. They hadn't learned the true lesson. Eleanor stood slowly, her movements deliberate, as she walked over to the window. She didn't need to look at them. She knew they were watching her, waiting for her to give them something. An apology? A gesture of reconciliation? They would wait for as long as it took. But Eleanor had no intention of giving them anything. She had already given them the lesson they had failed to learn. Power was not about wealth or status. It wasn't about marriage or family ties. It was about control. And now, she was the one who controlled everything. She turned back to them, her eyes sharp. "You will not question my decisions again," she said quietly, but the words rang clear. "You will not challenge my authority. Not now. Not ever." Lauren opened her mouth, as if to respond, but the words died on her tongue. She didn't have the strength left to speak. Nathan looked to his wife, his expression torn, but again, there was nothing he could say. They had been defeated, and the weight of that defeat was suffocating. Pat, still watching with quiet satisfaction, finally broke the silence. "You did it, Eleanor," she said softly. "You've proven your strength. And now, they know." Eleanor gave a small smile, but it was not one of victory. It was one of resolve. "This is only the beginning," she said, her gaze turning back to the garden. This was just the first move. The room seemed to hold its breath. Everyone in it understood. Eleanor had not just reclaimed her place in the family. She had set the stage for something bigger, something that would echo far beyond the walls of this house. And though the lesson had been learned, there was still so much more to teach. The afternoon drifted on, and Eleanor sat at her desk, papers neatly spread in front of her. The house was still. The quiet that had settled after the storm of the past few days was almost unnerving, but Eleanor found comfort in it. This peace, hard-won, was now hers to enjoy. Outside the window, the garden shimmered under the golden light, the breeze playing with the leaves, whispering its own song of serenity. She had done it. She had taken back what was hers. And now, for the first time in years, she could breathe without the weight of constant conflict bearing down on her. But as much as she relished in the calm, her mind was already moving ahead, planning the next step. Eleanor's fingers drummed lightly on the desk as she surveyed the documents before her. These weren't just ordinary papers. They were the next piece of the puzzle. The house, the assets, the financial security. All of it was now locked under her control. But Eleanor wasn't content with simply holding on to what she had. She had a larger vision in mind. She had already decided. A portion of her estate, of her wealth, would be redirected. It wasn't enough to simply preserve what she had. She had always believed in using her resources for something more than just her own comfort. It was time to shift her focus, time to invest in causes that would ensure her legacy extended far beyond this house, beyond her family. The wealth that had been fought for, that had been claimed with such careful precision, would now go towards something greater. It would be used to change lives, to make an impact in the world. Her fingers moved over the papers, her pen gliding smoothly as she made the necessary notations. The decision was final. The funds would be reallocated, part of her fortune going toward charities that spoke to her heart. Education, women's health, environmental causes. She would ensure that the world felt her presence, not just in the house she had claimed, but in the world she had always quietly observed. This was how she would truly make her mark. Nathan and Lauren, as they had been since the confrontation, were silent figures in the background, unable to interfere, unable to even comment on her decision. They were in no position to challenge her anymore, not after what had transpired. Victor's voice, smooth and reassuring as ever, broke through the silence. "Eleanor," he said, standing in the doorway, "all the allocations are secure. The charitable contributions have been processed as per your wishes. Nothing has been overlooked." Eleanor looked up at him, her gaze steady, and nodded. She didn't need reassurance. She had already made the decision, and now the process was complete. "Thank you, Victor," she replied, her voice calm, but there was a satisfaction in her tone. She had done what needed to be done. Pat, who had entered the room quietly, stood by the window, her eyes on the garden. But her mind obviously focused on the same thoughts that occupied Eleanor. The two women had been through a great deal together, but Pat had always understood Eleanor's quiet resolve. There was no need for applause, no need for grand speeches. Eleanor had executed her plan with precision, and now the rewards would come. A small smile tugged at the corner of Pat's lips. "I don't think anyone saw this coming," she said, her voice soft, but there was admiration in it. Eleanor didn't respond immediately, but the truth of Pat's words hung in the air between them. It was true. No one, not even Nathan or Lauren, had fully understood what Eleanor was capable of. They had underestimated her, thinking they could push her, manipulate her into submission. And yet, it wasn't force that had won the day. It was patience, strategy, and the quiet authority that had always been Eleanor's strength. As the guests began to file out, some casting furtive glances at Eleanor, others speaking in hushed tones, Eleanor allowed herself to simply observe. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their understanding. But there was something satisfying about their admiration. They had witnessed a woman, one they had all known, perhaps underestimated, reclaim her rightful place in the world. Eleanor had done what was necessary, and now, with the house, the estate, the charity, it was all secure. Her legacy was assured, and her influence would ripple out, touching the lives of people she would never meet. The peace she had fought for, the control she had so carefully taken, was hers to shape as she saw fit. As the last of the guests exited through the front door, Eleanor remained seated, the weight of the moment settling over her. The stillness was profound, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to simply rest in it. The calm, the satisfaction, the knowledge that the next chapter of her life was already unfolding before her. Pat moved to the desk, leaning slightly to look over the documents Eleanor had signed. "You've thought of everything," she said, admiration in her voice. Eleanor nodded. "It's never just about the victory," she replied, her tone quiet but firm. "It's about what you do after." The sound of the door closing softly behind the last of the guests echoed in the distance. Eleanor's gaze lingered on the papers in front of her, on the legacy she had begun to build, and as she sat there, poised and in control. She knew that the world outside was only beginning to see the real Eleanor Parker. The pieces had all fallen into place, and now the world would watch her next move. The days following Eleanor's final decision passed in a blur of satisfaction and quiet reflection. The world outside her home seemed to move on, but for those who had witnessed her reclaim control, it felt as though everything had shifted. Eleanor had not just won her battle. She had reshaped the very fabric of her family and, in doing so, had earned the admiration of those who had once underestimated her. In the weeks that followed, a quiet reverence settled over her. The once dismissed matriarch of the family was now something more, a woman whose strength could not be ignored. Eleanor had weathered storms, both in her personal life and in the more subtle battles of power that played out in the background. And now, those who had doubted her were forced to reckon with the reality of her authority. At first, the change was subtle. Her influence, long masked by a quiet demeanor, began to surface in small but undeniable ways. The guests who had once whispered behind her back now spoke in hushed tones of admiration. In private conversations, they called her a strategist, a woman who had moved with the grace of a master tactician playing the long game. She wasn't just the woman who had secured her assets, her house, her legacy. She was the woman who had seen through the entitlements of others, who had stripped away the masks they wore. Nathan and Lauren, once the powerful figures at the center of family events, began to recede into the background. Eleanor's once passive son was now the man caught between loyalty to his wife and the inevitable truth of his mother's dominance. The house was no longer a battleground for their control. It was Eleanor's domain. They had no claim here anymore. The whispers among the guests grew louder, and the power they had once held was slowly eroded. Victor, always the steady presence in Eleanor's life, confirmed that the fortress she had built remained intact. "All legal protections are solid," he said one afternoon, his voice as steady as ever. "There are no loopholes, no way for anyone to challenge what you've done. You've ensured that your position is unshakable." Eleanor looked at him with a quiet smile, the weight of his words settling over her like a warm cloak. She had done everything with precision, and now she could relax, knowing that no one, not Nathan, not Lauren, not anyone, could undo what she had so carefully constructed. Meanwhile, Pat watched from the periphery, her eyes filled with quiet admiration. Eleanor's victory had been swift and decisive, but it was her patience, her years of careful strategy, that had made it possible. The kind of victory Eleanor had achieved wasn't just about outsmarting others. It was about playing the long game, ensuring that every move she made was not just a reaction to the present, but a preparation for the future. One evening, as the two women sat together in the parlor, the weight of the moment finally hit Eleanor. She had spent decades in the shadows, watching, waiting, making choices that would come to fruition years later. But the fruits of her labor were now clear. She was no longer the passive observer. She was the architect of her own future. "I've spent my life watching others believe they could control what was mine," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but filled with resolve. "But I never lost sight of the bigger picture. I never let them believe they had the power. And now, look." She gestured toward the window, where the golden light of the late afternoon bathed the garden in warmth. "It's mine. All of it." Pat smiled softly, her gaze unwavering. "You've earned it, Eleanor. They never saw it coming." As they spoke, the world outside moved on, but something had changed. Eleanor had taken control. not just of her house and wealth, but of her legacy. And as that thought settled in her mind, she realized there was more to come. This victory, as satisfying as it was just the beginning. A week later, a letter arrived at Eleanor's home. It was unexpected, an invitation from a major magazine. They wanted to feature her in an article, a piece about how she had handled the complexities of family entitlement, how she had regained control and redefined her position. At first, Eleanor was surprised. It had never occurred to her that the world outside would take notice of her private battles. But then, as she read the letter again, the realization began to sink in. This was exactly the kind of recognition she had always known she deserved. It wasn't just about her family anymore. It was about her place in the world, the legacy she had built with her own hands. She smiled quietly to herself, the weight of the recognition sitting comfortably on her shoulders. "They've come for the story they never expected," she said to Pat, who had been quietly observing her reaction. Pat smiled back, a knowing look in her eyes. "And you'll give them a story they won't forget." The quiet satisfaction of her success lingered in the air, but Eleanor knew that what lay ahead would be even greater. The world had noticed her, and now it would be watching every move she made. But Eleanor wasn't worried. She had already proven she could control everything that mattered, and she wasn't about to stop now. Her legacy was unfolding, not in grand gestures, but in quiet, deliberate actions. And with each move, she would ensure that it lasted, far beyond the walls of her home, far beyond her family's fleeting influence. The world, at long last, would see her as she truly was. Not just the quiet matriarch, not just the woman who had waited, but the one who had built her future. And now, no one could take it from her. And Eleanor Parker was only getting started. The peace that followed Eleanor's victory was one she had long craved, but never in this form. It wasn't just the silence that filled the house, though that alone was a welcome relief after the tension of the past weeks. It was the certainty of it, the understanding that everything she had worked for was finally settled, finally secure. The quiet was not merely the absence of noise. It was the stillness of a carefully crafted strategy, the calm after the storm of shifting power. Eleanor sat alone in the library, the large windows framing the soft afternoon light that poured in, illuminating the rich mahogany furniture and the shelves lined with books. She had always loved this room. It was a space that felt both alive and timeless, a quiet sanctuary where her thoughts could unfold without interruption. The room was peaceful, but Eleanor was keenly aware that it was a peace earned through decades of planning, patience, and, most of all, control. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers grazing the edge of a book on the table, but she wasn't reaching for it. Her mind wasn't occupied with the past, nor the drama that had unfolded in recent days. She thought, instead, about what came next. The next chapter of her life, now that the tumult of her family's power struggles had been put to rest. Nathan and Lauren were a distant echo now. They still inhabited the house, of course, but their presence had become almost a formality. Their power, their influence, had dissipated as quickly as the storm clouds after a thunderstorm. The weight of their entitlement had been swept away, leaving them standing in the quiet ruins of their own expectations. There were no more arguments, no more demands. Eleanor knew their silence was not one of peace, but of recognition. They could no longer interfere. Their voices had been drowned out by the sheer strength of her authority. Her reflection was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Come in," Eleanor called, her voice steady and calm. Pat entered, carrying a tray with two delicate china teacups and a small pot of tea. She moved gracefully, as always, setting the tray down on the small table beside Eleanor. Pat's presence was a constant, a steadying force. And today, like every day since Eleanor's victory, her quiet approval was evident in the way she observed her friend. "I thought you might enjoy a bit of tea," Pat said, a knowing smile playing at the corner of her lips. "You've earned a moment of peace, haven't you?" Eleanor smiled softly. "I've earned more than that, Pat." She took the teacup, cradling it between her hands, savoring the warmth that spread through her fingers. The tea was a simple gesture, but to Eleanor, it symbolized more than just a calming drink. It was a ritual of peace, of completion. Pat settled into the chair across from her, folding her hands neatly in her lap. She didn't rush to speak, content to sit in the silence that was, in its own way, as comforting as the tea. Eleanor looked out the window once again, her gaze drifting toward the garden, where the flowers had bloomed brighter than before, as though echoing her own flourishing. The sun, now low in the sky, cast long shadows across the manicured lawn. It felt like the world was resting, but the stillness was, to Eleanor, a kind of triumph. "The world is beginning to understand," Pat said softly, breaking the quiet. "They see you for who you truly are now. Not just the matriarch they thought they knew." Eleanor nodded, her lips curling into a slight smile. "I've waited for this moment," she replied. "It's not about the victory alone. It's about making sure the world remembers what I've done and what I'll continue to do." Pat glanced at the door, then back at Eleanor. "And the future?" she asked, as if she already knew the answer. Eleanor set her cup down and looked at Pat, her eyes steady. "It's already in motion. I've already begun reallocating some of my funds to charity. A portion will go toward women's health, education, and the environment. These causes, they matter. I want my legacy to mean something, Pat. Not just to my family, but to the world." Pat's smile widened and she nodded. "It's a beautiful plan, Eleanor. They won't be able to ignore it." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, but her voice remained soft. "No, they won't. And I won't let them forget what I've done." Her gaze shifted back to the garden, a thoughtful look in her eyes. "The future isn't just about preserving what's mine. It's about creating something that will outlast all of this." Pat leaned back in her chair, content to let her friend reflect in silence. It wasn't just the estate, or the legal protections, or the funds that had secured Eleanor's position. It was her vision. She had been patient, waiting for the right moment to make her move, and now she was using her influence to reshape the world around her. The door opened once more, and Victor stepped in, his presence a quiet but steady reminder of the power Eleanor had secured. He didn't look at Pat as he approached Eleanor. His focus was on the papers in his hand. "All legal protections remain intact, Eleanor," Victor said, his voice firm. "There is no room for any challenges. The estate, the assets, all of it is secure. The legacy you've built is untouchable." Eleanor nodded, a small but satisfied smile touching her lips. She didn't need to hear it again, but it was reassuring all the same. "Thank you, Victor," she said, her voice steady. "I knew it would be." Victor nodded once and took a step back, glancing briefly at Pat before exiting the room. Pat watched him go, then turned her gaze back to Eleanor. "You've truly built something indestructible, Eleanor. They will never be able to tear it down." Eleanor took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling over her. She had done what was needed. The power, the control, the future. It was all hers now. She was finally free. But even as she savored the peace, a small flickering thought remained. The world had watched her succeed, but she knew this was not the end. It was just the beginning. And soon others would notice her influence, her charitable efforts, her legacy, and they would have no choice but to acknowledge her as the force she had always been. With a final quiet sip of her tea, Eleanor set the cup down. She wasn't finished yet. The world was watching, and Eleanor Parker was about to make sure they never forgot her name. The days bled into one another as the peace Eleanor had fought so hard to achieve settled like dust in every corner of the house. The world outside continued its daily march, unaware of the small, quiet revolution that had taken place within the walls of her home. But Eleanor knew. She could feel it in the stillness of the house, in the way the air seemed to hold its breath when she entered a room. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. Eleanor had spent years laying the foundation for this moment. Years of calculated silence, watching, waiting, observing. She had always known that control was not something you demanded. It was something you earned, something you kept hidden beneath layers of patience and subtlety. Now, the weight of her strategy was fully realized. Her fingers gently brushed the smooth surface of the desk in her study. Papers and books lay neatly arranged in front of her, but her mind wasn't on any of them. It was on the long road she had traveled, on the decades of sacrifices, decisions, and moments where she had simply let things unfold without interference. Now, all of it had led to this moment of calm, of mastery. Her mind flickered briefly to Nathan and Lauren. They were still here, still living under the same roof, but their influence had long been relegated to the past. Eleanor didn't need to force them into submission. They had, in their own way, submitted willingly, their rebellion snuffed out by the simple, undeniable truth of her power. They had learned at long last that their entitlement to her wealth, her home, her influence, meant nothing in the face of Eleanor's will. Nathan's eyes, once filled with passive resistance, now looked at her with something else. Respect, maybe, fear perhaps, but most importantly, understanding. He had finally seen the full extent of his mother's power, and it had been delivered without a single raised voice. Lauren, meanwhile, had retreated into herself, her arrogance shattered by the quiet certainty of Eleanor's position. They both knew it now. There was no way back, no room to maneuver. The door to her study creaked open, and Victor stepped inside, carrying the air of someone who had seen everything unfold from behind the scenes. His presence, always steady and reassuring, now seemed to carry a new weight. He was more than just the lawyer who had handled her affairs. He was her partner in this long game, a silent ally who had helped her protect everything she had fought for. "Eleanor," Victor said, his voice as smooth as ever, but with a hint of reverence. "All legal and estate protections remain permanent. There is no challenge left. The future is completely secured." Eleanor looked at him, her expression impassive, but there was a quiet pride in the way she nodded. "I knew it would be," she said softly, though there was no need to confirm it. She had built this, step by careful step. Now it was hers forever. Victor stood in silence for a moment, watching her as though waiting for something. Eleanor's gaze didn't waver from the papers in front of her, but she could feel the weight of his admiration. She had earned it. They both knew it. "Is there anything else you require?" he asked, his voice almost reverent. "No," Eleanor replied, setting down the pen she had been holding. "I'm done." As he left the room, Eleanor's thoughts shifted back to the future, to the world beyond these walls. The power she had claimed was now undeniable, and yet it wasn't enough. She had done more than just protect her assets. She had created something that would endure. She would leave a legacy not just for her family, but for the world. Her name would be known, not for the wealth she held, but for the quiet strength she had shown in reclaiming it. Pat entered the room quietly, as always. There was no need for words between them now. They both understood what had been achieved. They had seen the way the world had changed, how the guests who once whispered behind Eleanor's back now spoke with quiet admiration, if not outright respect. The battle had been won, and now they were watching the world begin to acknowledge it. The pieces have all fallen into place. Eleanor, Pat said, her voice a soft whisper of satisfaction. You've done what you set out to do. Eleanor's eyes met her friend's, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a small, contented smile. She had waited, watched, and now the world had shifted to her will. Pat set down a tray of tea between them, the delicate clink of the cups breaking the silence. Eleanor reached for the cup, but her mind was still elsewhere, on the world outside. She wasn't finished yet. There were plans to be made, strategies to unfold. But today, in this quiet space, she could savor the calm before the storm of her next move. Would you like to talk about what comes next? Pat asked, as she poured the tea, her eyes watching Eleanor closely. Eleanor's gaze turned back to the garden, where the last of the sunlight dipped behind the trees. Yes, she said slowly. I've already begun reallocating part of my estate. It's time to use my resources for something bigger, something that will last. Pat smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes. She had always known that Eleanor was destined for something far beyond the confines of her family home. I think they'll notice, Pat said softly. Oh, they will, Eleanor replied, her voice sharp now, filled with a quiet resolve. And when they do, they'll see exactly what I've built. Not just the house, not just the wealth, but the legacy. As they sat there in the quiet of the room, Eleanor knew that the next phase of her life had already begun. The world would watch, and they would understand her authority, her strength, her vision. And when the time came, Eleanor would stand tall and let the world read what she had written for herself, a legacy no one could take from her. They said I needed their permission, Eleanor said, almost to herself. I stood up, and I read the will, and let it speak for itself. She looked at Pat, a quiet satisfaction in her eyes. The game had been played, and now Eleanor Parker had won.